We're going to move on here. As a reminder, and those that are not here, we're now doing the system that whoever is the bearer of the Langubu curse for the day gets to decide who has to read their summary out loud. All right, it is Unit 0, Day 4. As I've said, today is our final day working on our Sermon on the Mount project in class. Starting next class, we're going to have daily assignments that are going to feel like a lot at first. The better your notes each day, the better you'll do, the easier it'll be. We're going to work through this as we go. It's going to be those notes at the end of class. The work you turn in at the end of class will be the notes that you get to use on the essays when we get to test days. So you need to be prepared for that, all right? If you don't do the work, if you're not here and you don't do the work, it's going to really bite you in the butt later on. Not right away, but later on. All right, so Unit 0, Day 4. You guys saw this word that I pointed out, ascetic. All right, so I'm going to give you the definition from this. I'm going to give you the definition for asceticism. An ascetic is a person that practices asceticism. All right, so that's not going to help you because you don't know what that is. So I'm going to give you asceticism. All right. If you guys want to read about real weirdos, really weirdos, there's some of these guys are really weird. Asceticism. I'll say that one more time. Asceticism. Asceticism. All right, here's our definition. The intentional removal of pleasures for comfort. I'll say most commonly for religious enlightenment. All right, I'll move out of the way for those in the back. I'm trying to write big because sometimes I write too small, is what I've been told. All right, asceticism is the intentional. I absolutely butchered the spelling of intentional. The intentional removal of pleasures or comfort, most commonly for religious enlightenment. This is you intentionally making yourself uncomfortable for the sake of growing closer to God in more simple terms. You guys, has anybody in here been at a church, you don't have to say if you have, but been at a church that practices fasting or heard of fasting? Anybody in here, raise your hand if you've ever gone to a church and says, we should do some fasting. Anybody? None of y'all? All right, I see like one or two hands. All right, some of us have done that. I haven't fasted in a while, even if I look like I have. I haven't fasted in a while, but fasting is where you don't eat for a while. Usually it's like 24 hours, or maybe I've known people that their fasting practices will be for 40 days of Lent. If the sun is up, they don't eat. So they only eat during the night or the morning, if they eat at all. Or they spend a time where the only food they eat is food that is given to them rather than food that they have prepared for themselves. These are ascetic practices. You're making life uncomfortable for yourself in some way in order to grow closer to God. All right? This has the goal, and this is where we can keep taking notes. Maybe we move past our vocab book into our regular book. Goal is dependence on God. All right, dependence. You're trying to nurture a feeling of trust and dependence on God. That it's not up to you to do anything, it's up to God to do things. Now, we're going to look mostly and talk mostly about Christian and Jewish asceticism, all right? The practices within Jewish and Christian traditions. But this exists beyond that as well. There's some examples, like I said, if you guys want to look at some real weirdos, there's some really weird people that practice this and would go extreme with this, right? These guys are typically extreme in the exact opposite way that those zealots were extreme. When we talk about the zealots, these guys, yeah, you can go higher, are like the exact opposite direction extreme. They want total removal. All right, I'm just going to say ascetics seek to punish fleshly desires. Punish fleshly, that's human, fleshly, I'm going to put parentheses, human desires. A good example of one of these is John the Baptist. We all probably know the name John the Baptist if we've been in church for any amount of time. We'll talk about him pretty soon coming up, but if you know John the Baptist, it's Jesus' cousin and probably mentor, all right? We believe that Jesus was the disciple of John the Baptist for at least some time because John had been ministering for a while before him. And John would wear camel fur. Now, when ascetics would wear camel fur, have any of you guys gone to a zoo and gotten to pet a camel? I know that's a weird question, but I have. Their fur is known, when Hiro gets back, their fur is known for being really coarse and rough, really uncomfortable. So if you take really coarse and rough fur and you make clothing out of it, how is that going to feel comfort-wise? Super uncomfortable, right? That's what he wore, and he wore it in a hot desert. So he walked around a desert wearing super uncomfortable, sweating, like the itchiest wool sweater you could have. That is one of the things he did. He intentionally only ate things that he could grab with his hands and harvest himself. Locusts or wild honey, right? He's eating bugs and honey is what he sustained himself off of. Why? Because he wanted to trust. He wanted to punish his fleshly desires and trust that God would sustain him. Right? The idea is that God will sustain all things. Some of these guys would, I just looked them up. There's this one guy, I wanted to get like more exact details. One guy had said in 436, so quite a while after Jesus, 436, this dude climbs up like a 50-foot column, and he didn't come back down for 30 years until he died. He lived there for the rest of his life as an ascetic practice on like a 30 or 40-foot column. That's just where he lived for the rest of his life. Because he wanted to deprive himself of any possible enjoyment, right? He's trusting that only God can give him whatever God's going to give him. So I know I'm not writing a bunch of stuff. You could still be taking notes on all this stuff. But the ascetics, their goal is not just we want to worship God, but it's we will worship God by rejecting ourselves, by denying our flesh. Jesus calls us to do this, some of this, and this is why I'm tying this with the Sermon on the Mount. We see this quite a bit too, that Jesus says to reject our fleshly desires. But this is where Jesus pulls on strings of asceticism. Jesus accepts asceticism. I'm just going to say, I don't feel like spelling this again, but whatever. Asceticism in Sermon on the Mount and challenges assumptions. Challenges the assumptions of asceticism and says, don't do this to look good in front of others. See, the Pharisees and Sadducees, they like to practice this stuff as well. They like to be ascetics, and they would fast for a few days here, a few days there. Actually, one day a week was the typical practice, a minimum of once a week. But they would make it showy and let others see it. So Jesus says if you're going to do these practices, you shouldn't even tell somebody you're doing it. Right? If you're going to deprive yourself of food for a week, go sit at dinner with people. Sit around it and be around it, and just don't even tell them. Just don't even eat. But just say, no thank you, not for me. Right? Jesus says this type of thing, and he says, yeah, deny that you need these things and trust in God. He wants us to have the trust, while at the same time not gaining. Delari's going to go when Hiro's back, and then you can go. So, without gaining the benefit of earthly, of earthly righteousness, looking good in front of others, right? He's going to challenge these assumptions while at the same time naming we should have some of this. He is influenced by these guys. Jesus is absolutely influenced by ascetics and ascetic practices and wants us to have similar dependence on God in all things. All right, another thing that we're going to get coming forward in our book as we read The Shadow of the Galilean, we're going to read about these guys called the Essenes. Essenes, Essenes. This is ascetic community. Ascetic community. Lives in desert. Extreme rejection of the world. Extreme rejection of world. All right. This is an ascetic community of Jews. I'll add that. Of Jews. I'm going to add another thing here. They reject, I'll move out of the way in a second, reject the temple cult. Remember last class, I think you guys put it in your vocab books, the temple cult and what that was. These guys reject the temple cult and say, we don't need to go there, we don't need to go to the temple. We don't need to do what you do with the sacrifice in our own places. Sacrifice their own bodies. They are an ascetic community. They are extreme. We're going to read about them in this book, and we're going to see our character, spoiler alert, we'll see our character go visit some of these guys, and he's going to give some of their beliefs. I didn't know a lot of it until I had read this book. It is real extreme. Like, I was kind of shocked by the things that I discovered through this book. I was like, oh, I didn't know that these guys were like this. They live in the desert. They're a desert-dwelling community. They are intentionally away from the world and from cities. Right? They want to have total independence of anything made by humans, anything made by people that's not from their community. They're trying to reject. Right? Extreme rejection of the world. Their idea, their religious idea here in this type of community, and I would say Jesus is aiming against this. It's like, no, we need to be part of the world. In fact, Paul ends up saying, be part of the world, not of the world, right? They're speaking at these guys. They're saying, no, we are here. Take care of people here. Be here. Dwell here, but just don't be part of it, right? Be part of it, be here, but don't be of the same thing, of the like mind. So he's even rejecting these communities, this community. The thing about the Essenes, though, is we do have to thank them. I'm going to say likely responsible, and I would go into this if I could, likely responsible for Dead Sea Scrolls. These are, all right, these Dead Sea Scrolls are something that we have. We would have to spend a whole bunch of time, and I'm not an expert on this, but Dead Sea Scrolls is, to my knowledge, the oldest, oldest, most intact Hebrew Bible. And again, that's the term we're using this semester, or one of the terms we're using this semester for the Old Testament. They have every book that we have as the Old Testament. They have every book collected, and they have a big collection of them from like 200 BC going onwards, right? They have a huge library of them. That's the oldest one, where it's every single book that we have in the Old Testament, all collected together, all intact, except for the book of Esther, notably, which causes some challenges to Esther, whatever. But they have this collection. They have some other books as well. So we see that, all right, there's some importance in this religiosity. These guys did believe in being Jewish. But we're going to see that Jesus is speaking against this type of extremism and this type of separation. So we're going to keep seeing some of this stuff. I wish I could spend way more on this. We're going to work on our Sermon on the Mount thing for the rest of class. That's about 45 minutes, or 40 minutes, 35? I don't know, whatever, 35 minutes. My goal is 35 to 40 minutes every day of work time. We're going to work on the Sermon on the Mount project, because the Sermon on the Mount is going to be where we see centrally, and we're going to talk about it later. It is the central core teaching of Jesus, right? It starts, Sermon on the Mount, I'll put it like this: Sermon on the Mount, core ethical teachings of Jesus. Teachings of Jesus. Luke and Matthew have versions of it. Two of the four Gospels have versions of this. Both have the Beatitudes. I'm going to go ahead and tell you, I will be asking that in just a little bit for the exit ticket. All right, both Matthew and Luke in the Sermon on the Mount have the Beatitudes. Sorry, I moved this way. They both have the attitudes. This is the core ethical teachings of Jesus. When Jesus says, "This is how to follow me," this is where he says it. Right, we see his other his teachings show up elsewhere, and he infuses them places. But oh man, I could spend forever talking about this. Sermon on the Mount is the core teachings of Jesus for ethics. That's why I'm having you guys do this. Right? If you want to say, what does it mean like to practice Christianity? It's the 3 chapters that you guys are writing down in your books. To practice Christ's teachings, he says, this is what it is. Do these things. And you're going to read it and you're going to go, I can't do it. The best quote that I've heard of, I think it was last semester, a senior started reading this for a project they have in senior class, and his comment was, oh man, I'm bad at all of these. Yeah, they're really hard, but that's why we're practicing them and going to read them with our family. Because everybody thinks they mean something kind of different. So, that being said, go ahead. You have the rest of class as work time. Get this project going. I would encourage you to be at least through chapter 5 or 6 today if you can, and then get working on it, all right? As Ayana and I were talking, it's not hard, but it's time-consuming, right? You got all the way through chapter 5 already. It's time-consuming. So get focused on that. There should be quite a few words that you don't know yet. I know asceticism should be in your vocabulary books. And then if there's any others that we read in the book, make sure you go back, grab it, and ask me for the definition. You have the rest of class.